Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Fitness Education Series produced by the Australian Fitness Academy. It's like progressive overload for your brain. I'm your host, Tom Rock, and in today's episode, I'm going to talk about movement velocity. We'll start with sort of what it is, why it's important, or why it can be important, and then we'll look at some different ways you can potentially utilize it in your training to make sure you or your clients are getting the most out of it. It's not something you definitely need to use, but can be a cool little tool that you might see implemented in the gym more and more, or see it out there. So it's good to know maybe a little bit about why you might use it, why you might not need it, and what it would take to potentially implement it or think about it within your training. So movement velocity is important in all aspects of training. So we'll talk about velocity-based training as we sort of move through it. But initially, movement velocity is basically how fast we're moving when we complete an exercise. So how fast are we lifting the bar or whatever movement we're doing. If it's a squat, is it a bench press, is it a deadlift? It could be a bicep curl. What is our movement velocity? And movement velocity is an important aspect of training. Eventually, I think initially, if you're training beginner clients or someone who's learning movements, we want to be doing movements with control. So they're getting correct technique to reduce risk of injury and doing things wrong. So control is really, really important. Sets, reps and things, prescribe it, but make sure they're doing the exercise well. And generally as a beginner, or even as you're sort of starting to advance or trying a new exercise, control is really important, and you generally want to instruct your exercise and encourage people to probably value exercise technique, definitely probably value exercise technique more than moving the bar as fast as they possibly can. Once a client has sort of developed the coordination and the ability to perform an exercise well and competently, movement velocity is an important aspect to them getting the most out of the exercise. So what it allows us to do is activate the high threshold motor unit. So we're going to activate more muscle fibers, and generally the high threshold motor units are going to activate the type 2 muscle fibers, where we're going to see a majority of our sort of hypertrophy or muscle gain from. So in order to get them to grow, we need to get them activated and stimulate those muscle fibers. And moving something as fast as we can is a great way to switch on our neuromuscular recruitment of these fibers and stimulate them. So if we're moving a bar slowly, it depends on how you classify slowly. We need to be giving maximal effort. So if we're giving maximal effort, we're going to be stimulating these high threshold fibers, type 2 fibers, which are going to hopefully look to, if hypertrophy is our goal, we're going to build some hypertrophy of those fibers. If we're not putting enough effort into how fast we move the bar, then we're probably not going to activate those high threshold motor units, and we're not sending a big enough signal to say, I need to recruit my largest muscles to lift this bar, or use my maximal strength or effort to move this weight. So once a client has the ability to lift with good technique, we want to make sure they're applying enough intensity to each exercise. We want to keep it, obviously control is important, and you want to make sure you're maintaining control and technique throughout the movement, but we should be trying to accelerate the bar as fast as possible. Now, when we talk about movement velocity, I say we should be moving the bar fast. The bar might not move fast, so if I'm lifting 50% of my maximum, I'm going to be able to push the bar up very fast if we're talking about a bench press. If I use 90% of my maximum, when I push that bar up, it's going to go slower. So the movement velocity of that bar is going to be slower, but it's important that it doesn't matter how slow it goes, but I need to be pushing it up as fast as I can. So putting in as much effort as possible. And I think that's a really important concept to start teaching our clients once they get past that initial beginner and intermediate stage, teaching them how to apply effort to each exercise or each rep is really important to making sure they're going to get the most benefit out of that rep. So that's a really important thing to consider, I think. So initially with velocity-based training, which we'll sort of talk about now, is basically it's using these velocity or movement speeds to track our training or potentially educate us on our training. And there's a number of ways that can happen. But initially, we can sort of start to indicate which reps are good reps and which reps are bad reps. So if I can get feedback on, well, the bar moved this fast, the bar moved at 4 meters per second as I was doing my lift, then you can sort of start to see what happens. And during a set, you'll find that your rep speed or movement velocity decreases. As fatigue kicks in, we're going to get less and less movement velocity. We start to fatigue, the bar's going to move slower. So we can see changes rep to rep, but it could also help us see changes week to week. And really, if we are focusing on pushing that bar speed or maximizing muscle recruitment or motor unit recruitment, we can make sure our athlete or our client is putting in that effort rep to rep. And it can really be a good visual stimulus to see numbers in movement speed on how each rep was. So that's a good, it can be a good tool. Again, you want to make sure technique is sound and they're quite competent before we will start doing that, but it can be a good measure and help them understand that they need to be applying effort to each rep. So I think that's how it can sort of help to monitor training quality, so we can make sure each rep and each set we're trying to push that velocity as fast as we can. As soon as we start to see big decreases, we're probably fatigued, and if we're super fatigued, we're not going to be activating those motor units that we're looking to. It may even show you if you're not resting enough between sets. If I don't take enough rest between set and only rest 30 seconds or a minute, I might see my next set I'm not able to move that bar as fast, which means I'm potentially not activating those type 2 motor units. So that it can potentially also show that, which is quite interesting. Another probably good way to implement or a good use of movement velocity or velocity-based training is being able to estimate our 1RM. So 1RM is our 1 repetition maximum, and it's a very common strength way to measure your strength, and it can be a good tool to measure progress, or even people will use it for programming. So I'll do, if I know what my 1RM, and that's 100%, if I want to do, say, 5 sets of 5, I might program 80% of my 1RM. But I need to know, in order to work out what 80% is, I need to know what my 1RM is. The problem with 1RM is that it's not unsafe, but for beginners, when their technique isn't good, 1RM is not a great tool to use, because you need to have maximum weight, and it's not a very good test for beginners, or it might not be sort of useful in any sense. Like, we have to do a full fatiguing effort, so you have to go to failure. Your 1RM, it generally takes a little bit of time to test it, so it's not always practical. And we'll look at, and it might not be practical depending on the lift, like deadlift work, bench press, squat potentially, but if you're doing a 1RM back squat, you're generally pushing pretty close to failure. You've got to test till you fail. So you need to be in a setup where if you do fail on the squat, you're not making it any more unsafe than it already is. So 1RMs are potentially, they're done a lot, and they're a good measurement, a good tool to measure strength in sort of your intermediate and advanced lifters potentially, but for beginners, they're quite unsafe. With movement velocity, we can actually get our 1RM without going to failure. There's other methods to get 1RM if I don't want to put, say, 100 kilos on my 1RM on my back squat. You can sort of do maybe a 5 rep max or a 6 rep max, and then estimate your 1RM off that. There's a lot of calculators online where you can plug in what your 5RM max was, and that'll spit out a number, and that's your estimated 1RM, which can be quite accurate depending on the lift and how close to failure you are, or how many reps you've done. But those tests still require you to go to complete failure. So your 5th rep should be a grind, and you try to get your 6th and you can't get it. So again, you'll need spotters and things like that, which not everyone has available at the gym. Movement velocity, if you can track your movement velocity of your lift for your squat or your bench press, for example, you don't actually need to go to failure to get an estimate of your 1RM. There's been a lot of research done on the bar speed or the movement speed of a 1RM on each lift, and I'll talk about sort of velocity-based training later, but there's a link, and I'll put that link in the description, and that's got a really good article and visual on using velocity-based training to estimate your 1RM, and basically it's almost a linear relationship. So if I do a rep at 40% of my 1RM or 40%, roughly 40% of my 1RM, and I do a rep at 60 and maybe 80, I don't need to go to failure. I get my bar speed and what my capabilities of movement speed on those lifts are, and then I can put it into a graph and I can estimate what my 1RM will be based on that sort of linear relationship. As my weight gets heavier, my movement speed goes down. And then I know that a 1RM bench press, the general minimum velocity for that is 0.16 meters per second. So when my line gets to that, I sort of just go across and I can see what weight potentially or estimated that will be for me. So measuring your movement velocity allows you to get an idea of what your maximum weight will lift without having to go to failure. It's based on the velocity of your lower lifts, which don't require your lift to failure. You've just got to put in a high effort and lift that bar as fast as you can. So it can be a really useful tool. So it allows you to potentially track the quality of your training and even measure improvements in your training as well. It can be good for power training as well, because it allows us to look at force and speed, and I can see even if I'm doing the same weight as I was last week in a lift, maybe this velocity-based training shows I'm actually moving it faster, which is an improvement in being able to apply the force faster. Probably show I'm getting stronger without having to lift potentially more weight. So it's really cool like that. I think, and it's the thing about movement velocity is it's now getting more readily available in terms of being able to potentially do it in the gym. You can generally do it on the phone these days. There is, like, the gold standard is what we call linear position transducers, and GymAware is an example of that. It's basically a box that's got a cord that you will attach to the barbell, and that measures it. But these gold standards linear position transducers are quite expensive. I think the GymAware is roughly $1,500, and then you need to subscribe to their software as well per year. So but that's the gold standard. They do studies, they'll use things like GymAware and linear position transducers to measure improvements or power changes or look at fatigue, all these sorts of things. But these days, as the technology keeps advancing and developing different options, there was a whole range of sort of Bluetooth devices that that were pretty big for a while. So I think Bar Sensei was one, Pushband was another one, where you'd sort of have a device attached to the bar, and that would sort of measure movement velocity using accelerometers and things like that. They were sort of showed not to be super reliable and valid, so they're sort of not as popular these days. But now there's a lot of development behind apps and video based monitoring of a barbell to get movement speed. And there's a lot of apps out there that are sort of shown to be valid and reliable. There's a couple of apps. I think one is VBT Metric is an app, and Powerlift is another one. I think it's Metric VBT. Sorry, Metric VBT, Powerlift is another one. But movement velocity apps that you'll film your lift and it'll tell you the movement velocity. So at the end of each set, you can sort of see the movement velocity of each rep as you go. So there's some different options out there now which allow you to actually utilize it in your own training a little bit less invasively, rather than sort of setting up a big thing in the gym. If you've got your phone and the capability to sort of film your lifts, you can track movement velocity. And it might not be something you do on every lift or every session, but once a week or once a fortnight, you might film your main lifts potentially, or use the VBT app or velocity-based training on certain lifts to see where you're at. It can help you sort of manage session to session as well if you're using it regularly. There's a lot of sessions we come in, we don't feel super fresh, so we're sort of we just don't feel fresh. We didn't get much sleep, our recovery hasn't been good, all these sorts of things. And if we know where our velocity usually sits, we can adjust the weight so we're still getting a good stimulus and moving a good bar speed based on our fatigue. Or it helps us see maybe we're a little bit fatigued today, doing a sort of slightly reduced session volume or session length, or getting some extra recovery in. We might be able to see based on that sort of lack of movement velocity that we usually see. So that can be another good option too. But Yeah, velocity-based training is definitely out there. If you haven't seen it, much of it, definitely give it a Google. Have a look at that link that I sent. There's lots of good articles out there these days. Again, you don't have to run out and buy the app and start filming every lift by any means. It can be a tool to utilize. Lots of different ways to coach without it for sure. But it's another interesting aspect that is out there these days in terms of another aspect of our training that we can monitor and adjust and look to prescribe around different variables and a tool to use maybe to have safer exercise testing or monitor improvements in our clients and potentially relay these improvements to them so they sort of see what it means and discuss little things, and then they can see their own improvements, and that helps motivate them as well. But a really cool little tool that you can sort of look into, and if you're interested in, it's a really interesting space to get into. But again, definitely not always necessary and suits different clients differently, but you might find it an interesting tool to utilize in your own training in terms of fatigue management or exercise prescription or sets and reps prescription. You might have, instead of prescribing a weight, you might prescribe a movement velocity that you're trying to get to, or you might, as soon as your movement velocity drops maybe 20%, you finish the set. So there's different ways to manage your fatigue and manage your stimulus based on movement velocity as well. So yeah, lots of cool options around that. But hopefully that gives you a bit of a rundown of what it is, guys, different ways you can think about movement velocity and why it's important in the gym initially, and then yeah, how you could potentially look to utilize it in your training. If you've got any question on that, definitely send an email to tom@afa.com.au. Happy to keep it going, keep the conversation going, chat about it further. Or if you've got any other topics or questions you'd like me to answer or discuss, email me as well. And I'm always happy to cover any topics you guys would like to hear me discuss. Other than that, guys, have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you all soon.